So break for the next 15 minutes. I don't think there were any questions on Zoom land, but so I think we're good there. So go. Oh, Paul, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I just
yes, go.
One final thing, just a couple of testimonials. One is a personal observation with the drone. One of the first jobs that we did was a strawberry field that had spider mites, and spider mites were always on the underside of the leaf. We went out and flew on a miticide and killed spider mites. It was really impressive. That actually sold me on the drone more than anything. The other thing is kind of a testimonial from one of my berry growers, and he really feels where the drone shines is in crop loss or the lack of crop loss. And you're just not knocking fruit off. So that's a huge deal. And that's been an area where it's really shined as well. So
yeah, good stuff. Okay, well, thank you. Go get a cup of coffee and appreciate a sponsor while you're doing it. Yes. Okay. Share screen.
Yeah, no, your presentation.
So we're good.
Yeah, I'm going to try to on it today.
So we have Dani Lightle. She is with OSU, part of the IR4 program. Much needed, and so she's going to go over some Bulletins Live 2, which I know that you guys have heard about this. She's made a really heavy focus on this entire off season, but it's going to be a little more interactive for this one. If I stop talking now and actually give her half an hour, and then also Endangered Species Act.
So I recognize the vast majority of faces in this room, which is awesome because probably the vast majority of you have seen me give this talk at least once so far this off season. So I'm going to really briefly, for any of you who aren't familiar what's going on with the Endangered Species Act and EPA, I'm going to touch on that, and then I'm going to go over the basics of Bulletins Live 2. And then, assuming the computer cooperates, we'll go in and we'll demonstrate how to use it live instead of just my screenshots. And so hopefully that will help you understand how the system works a little bit better. So we're going to start with FIFRA, which is the Federal Insecticide and Fungicide Rodenticide Act, which is the legislation that allows EPA to register pesticides. And then we also have the Endangered Species Act. So the Endangered Species Act was enacted in 1973, a little over 50 years old now. What the Endangered Species Act says is that any federal entity, so that would be EPA, that does an official action, which would be an official action would be registering a pesticide, that they must be in compliance with the Endangered Species Act and ensuring that that action doesn't risk harm to a listed species, a threatened species or an endangered species. And EPA has, through various ways, shapes, and forms, been trying to come into compliance with this for over 50 years. But the fact of the matter is that a very, very small number of active ingredients have been evaluated at somewhere in the realm of 5% of all of our registered actives have actually gone through the consultation process to make sure that there's no risk listed species. And because of that, EPA is continuously, especially the last decade, fighting off litigation so that essentially groups are suing EPA for being out of compliance with the Endangered Species Act. The risk to that as you as growers is that the courts find that EPA is in violation of the Endangered Species Act, is that registrations can be revoked or vacated by the courts. So the courts can just say, look, you're not in compliance with the Endangered Species Act. We're going to vacate this registration, and then you have no label. This has really come to a head in the last year with what's known now as the mega suit. So the mega suit was filed way back in 2011, but it wasn't settled until 2023. Two different groups filed suit against the EPA. There was the Center for Biological Diversity and the Pesticide Action Network. And they sued EPA for being out of compliance with the Endangered Species Act for 382 active ingredients. This was reduced to 35 active ingredients in the settlement, but a huge number of active ingredients for being out of compliance. As I mentioned, the settlement was signed in September just last year, and there was a fair amount of press about it in the ag newspapers, so you may have seen that. But essentially what the settlement did, it reduced the active ingredients to 35, and it set a whole bunch of different deadlines for development of different plans. So the one that received a lot of press in this area was the Vulnerable Species Pilot Plan. They also have a herbicide strategy framework and a rodenticide biological evaluation and framework. And then deadlines a little bit in the future are for the insecticide strategy and the fungicide strategy. Here's what the deadlines look like. And that slide is bad. Okay, so the herbicide strategy, the original deadline was May 30th, 2024. A couple weeks ago, EPA was granted an extension of that deadline by the courts. So we're now expecting the final herbicide strategy at the end of August 2024. The deadline for the rodenticide biological evaluation for the finalized rodenticide plan is in November of this year. We are expecting the draft herbicide strategy, EPA is saying by July 31st of this year. And they are supposed to finalize it per the settlement in the first quarter of next year. And then we're going to get a separate biological evaluation specifically focusing on OPs, organophosphates. So the Vulnerable Species Pilot Plan, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about at this particular moment because EPA has essentially put that on hold. Essentially, it picked 27 of what EPA was considering the most vulnerable species, or the species that were most likely to be impacted by pesticides, and designated critical areas to be no spray. So no, essentially no sprays of any sort except for homeowner. In the Pacific Northwest, this was for protection of Taylor's checker spot butterfly, which has about a 20-acre range in Oregon. The plan received very widespread pushback across the board. And earlier this, well, I guess last month, around February 7th, EPA said that they were going to put this entire plan on hold until more defined species ranges were released. So they are coming up with a set of protocols that they're going to follow for defining these ranges. And until all of that is ironed out, this plan's not moving forward. The next one is the draft herbicide strategy. This one, as I mentioned, is still in the proposal stage. It's a draft. The details of it, we can read the tea leaves. We know probably some of the things that are going to wind up in it. The fine points are still going to change. Essentially what it does, it's going to evaluate the risk of an herbicide to a listed species population. It's going to identify mitigations that can help offset that risk. And then it's going to define the geographic locations, essentially, where those mitigations are going to be in place. Then those geographic restrictions are going to be added to Bulletins Live Two. Most of these mitigations have to do with drift reduction, runoff reduction, soil erosion reduction. And EPA is taking a pick list approach. So we do know that this is most likely going to wind up in the final plan, where you can pick and choose different sets of mitigations that work for your operation. And when you have enough of those in place, then you'll be able to use herbicides that have a high runoff or erosion risk profile to them. The rodenticide strategy framework, the comments on this closed in February. What they decided here to do was evaluate the risk of bait consumption to primary consumers. So these are going to be listed species that would be at risk of eating the bait itself, or secondary consumers. So these are going to be species that ate something that ate the bait. From the range maps that EPA provided in their draft plan, we know that much of the Willamette Valley is going to be impacted, primarily from risk to secondary consumers. Right now, there's a whole list of restrictions that EPA has proposed to offset some of these risks. Some of the most pertinent ones are that all products are going to be designated as restricted use. So that's going to be all of our rodenticides. You can still get product out there currently that is not RUP. They're also proposing to add this carcass search and disposal language, which would require you to go back to areas where you have baited and check to make sure that there's no dead things above the ground that a secondary consumer could come eat. And again, these restrictions are expected to be put into place by geographic location and added to Bulletins Live Two. All right, so what we do know, there's a couple threads going on here, but we know that virtually everything is going to be put into Bulletins Live Two. We know that almost every pesticide going through pesticide re-registration right now is getting Bulletins Live Two language added to it, even if there's not specifically mitigations in Bulletins Live Two for that product at this particular point in time. So we're going to just go through some of EPA's definitions here first. The first thing we have are endangered species protection bulletins. And these are essentially these geographic specific restrictions on where you can use the pesticide. And the EPA is calling these endangered species protection bulletins. And it's an extension of the general label that you have to get through this website called Bulletins Live Two. And we talked earlier about how your minimum GPA, if there's a required minimum GPA, you have to follow that. Label is the law. This is the same thing. If your label tells you that you need to check Bulletins Live 2 for an endangered species protection bulletin, you need to do that. Should you be audited, ODA enforcement will want to make sure that you have done that. We're going to do another definition here, and this one is, I hear it pronounced both ways, PULA or PULA. This stands for a pesticide use limitation area. So if there's a limitation on a pesticide, that's necessary to protect a listed species, then this is essentially the geographic range where those restrictions will be in place. So they're calling this a pesticide use limitation area, and this is what's going to show up in Bulletins Live 2 as a spot where mitigations are applicable. The bulletin itself, we will look at them later on, but it's going to have a couple different components. It's going to have the spatial location for where the restriction is applicable. It's going to talk about what the product is, the application type, the formulation, is it a granular, is it an EC, what's the active ingredient, so on and so forth. And then it's going to give you any associated mitigation language that goes with that product. And like I mentioned, bulletins are an extension of the label. You will frequently see Bulletins Live 2 abbreviated as BLT. I don't know what happened to Bulletins Live 1. Okay. These are labels that I know of that either currently have Bulletins Live 2 language or shortly will. This list is just going to keep growing because everything going through re-registration is getting Bulletins Live language put on it, whether there are mitigations in the system or not. The idea is that that way, because label changes are difficult to do per EPA's process, this way, everything has Bulletins Live 2 language on it, and then EPA can add mitigations into the system later if it's needed. So some of our actives, at the top here we have herbicides, bromoxynil, metolachlor, permethrin, S-metolachlor, dicamba. If anybody's fumigating, I don't know how frequently you guys are doing that, telone is going to have that language. Cyantraniliprole, which is Exirel, has that language. I would expect to see next growing season on the label. Methoxyfenicide, Intrepid 2F already has that language on it. Malathion and diazinon will probably start to see maybe as early as next growing season. It depends how long it takes that product to work through the distribution system. And then which uses are affected, pretty much any of them. If Bulletins Live language is on the label, you're gonna have to be checking the system. So here's an example of what that label language looks like. Anybody use dual magnum? A few of you, okay. If you were to go and look in something like Agrian, this new label is up there. If you have newer product, you should be checking. If you have older product, probably doesn't have it on there yet. Under the directions for use section, so this box right here, the ag use requirements box, that's what you would check for your REI. Above that, on this particular label, it says endangered species protection requirements. And then I've blown up the pertinent part here. It says, when using this product, you must follow the measures contained in the Endangered Species Protection Bulletin for the area in which you are applying the product. You must obtain a bulletin no earlier than 6 months before using the product. This one's off of Intrepid 2F. This one is frustrating because most of the other labels that I've looked at for the endangered species protection requirements have been under directions for use. On Intrepid, they stuck it under use restrictions. So this is storage and disposal box, product info, then they have use restrictions, and we have endangered species up here. This one reads, when using this product, you must follow the measures contained in the Endangered Species Protection Bulletin for the county in which you are applying the product. To obtain bulletins no more than 6 months before using the product, consult this website. You must use the bulletin valid for the month in which you will apply the product. Okay, there's a couple different website options or links that will eventually all get you there. Some of the, like I think this link here, this epa.gov/ESPP, which is the one they put on the label, I don't recommend. I've surveyed growers, and if you follow that link, people have a really hard time getting to the Bulletins Live 2 application. So even though that's the one they stuck on there, it's not a great link. You can use this one, epa.gov/pesticides/bulletins, or what I think is the simplest approach, just Google Bulletins Live 2. It's going to be the first result. When do you have to do this? So as the label language said, anywhere from 6 months before you plan to do the application. So if you're planning on a spray program that would require Intrepid in July, we're within 6 months of that, so you could pull that bulletin right now. Up until technically the day that you do the application, but the month that you do the application, that bulletin will be available. One thing to take note of is that you can't go back in time. So EPA only has current month to 6 months from now as options for the bulletins, and the bulletins will have a month on them when you either save the file or print it out. So should you be under an enforcement audit and you don't have a copy of this bulletin, but you sprayed something in November that had Bulletins Live language on it, you cannot go back in time to get a bulletin from November to show to ODA. It's only forward looking. All right, so here I'm going to be brave. I'm going to try to use the website, and I have screenshots to fall back on if we get stuck.
You have to have a paper bulletin on hand, or can you just save
You could save a file.
Pull it up online?
You can save the file. So if you have electronic records, you could go ahead and just, file save as for the PDF and keep that in a file folder on your computer, or you could print it off. We know that record keeping resources are really desperately needed, and I've applied for a specialty crop block grant to help develop those. I won't know on that until next month whether we receive that. But hopefully, we know that that is a resource that's desperately needed, are ways to just help curate and make sure that the appropriate records are being kept. Okay, so these are the search results if you just Google Bulletins Live 2, and you just want this very top one, which says view the bulletins. And the site is occasionally down. I would say I'm in this a lot. It works probably 98% of the time for me, which frankly isn't too bad for a government website. Okay, I'm gonna unpin the directions, but it does have directions here. But I'm just gonna get rid of this so we can, maybe not. Okay, so here's what our application looks like. We have obviously a map of the United States. We can search by location, or we can just zoom in. So we're just gonna zoom into Oregon here. And we're gonna get some colors once it loads. So anywhere where there's pink on this map is showing where there is a PULA or pesticide use limitation area. And we're seeing kind of two different areas. I guess that kind of looks, on your computer, I promise it looks pink. We have kind of two different sets of PULAs in here. We have all of these fingers along water. These are PULAs that are for salmon. And so this is going to be National Marine Fisheries Service jurisdiction, and they're the ones who are reviewing those pesticides. The other giant PULA that we have here is the entire Willamette Valley. This right now is for cyanotraniliprole. I mentioned X-Roll a little bit ago. I had some active ingredients on the list that have Bulletins Live 2 language, but that don't currently have or may never have PULAs in the Pacific Northwest. So for example, Intrepid has PULAs in Michigan. But because the Bulletins Live language is on the label, you still need to go and check to make sure that there are no Intrepid or methoxyfenazide restrictions in your spray area. So I'm just going to zoom in to where NREC is, because that's where I work and I keep an eye on what's going on here. And so we still see we have our two different PULAs here. We have along the, can you see my mouse moving? You can. Okay, so we have along the waterways. These are going to be the salmon, and we have the rest of the area that is the cyanotraniliprole. So we have some different options for how we can enter in our information. First thing we have is the drop-down menu for which month you're planning on applying. And like I said, it only goes out 6 months. And as you can see, I can't go back to February. I can't go back to December. You can only go from this month forward. So we can get from March through September. And let's just imagine we're going to spray in June. And then there's two different ways to do this. The way that EPA recommends to do this is you take the registration number off of the bottle that you have. And I think I've memorized this at this point. This should be dual magnum. So we go ahead and we put in that registration number, and it's actually going to refine that PULA down because dual magnum only has a PULA along the rivers for the salmon. So it automatically fill in the product name so you can make sure that it matches what's on your jug. If it doesn't match, you've got a mistake somewhere. If you are familiar with the fronts of pesticide bottles, there's usually a couple different numbers. If you put the wrong number in, you're not going to get the right material that pops up here. So you want the EPA registration number. Okay. My plots are exactly right here. So if I click on the map, see this is red here. It's not going to let me print it off because I have a PULA in the area and a PULA not. But we can click in this PULA and it's going to turn green. And now I can print this bulletin off and it's going to pull up our PDF. So here is the information that ODA might be looking for. They're going to look for the application month. So you did this application. We're going to go forward in time. Say you're being audited next fall. You did this application in June. So they're going to want to see that this application month, the bulletin says June. I have been submitting comments to EPA and I will continue to submit comments to EPA to allow it so that we could check bulletins for an entire growing season instead of getting one for each month. Right now, EPA hasn't agreed to do that, but there is push to try and simplify this process for growers. Unfortunately, right now, EPA's guidance is that you have to get it for each month. It's going to list the product right here, dual magnum. And then it's going to have the limitation area. So you want to make sure that your application site, for me, that's right here, is showing up on the map as being either in or out of the PULA. So we're going to imagine here we're spraying in this area, which is designated as the limitation area. And it's going to say, look below to the use limitation table. So here we have the pesticide use limitation table and the codes and limitations table. So this first one, essentially, you would want to go through and find your use. So here's our product, the active ingredient, escatolochlor, the use. So is it an agricultural use or non-cropland use? Method, is it aerial or ground? The form should be all the same for this. And then it's going to kick you to a code. So for example, if we wanted to spray dual magnum by drone, then we would want to be looking at this line because that's an aerial application and follow this code. If we're applying by ground, then we would follow this line. These codes right now have tended to be the same within Bulletins Live 2, but they're not guaranteed to be. For example, we're seeing more restrictions come in on aerial applications. So this code then is going to kick you down to this table, SRF 22 matches, and here is our mitigation or our limitation. So for the dual magnum, if you're applying within 50 meters of salmon habitat, so if you're within 50 meters of this waterway that has salmon, don't apply the product when the soil is saturated or a runoff producing storm is forecasted by the NOAA National Weather Service to occur within 48 hours following application. So that would be the mitigation that you need to follow for this product if you're within 50 meters of the waterway. All right, so that's one way that we can work with the system. It's a little bit clunky because it is product by product. And as we start to see more products go into the system, that is going to be a pain to sit there and look through every single active ingredient that you're putting in there. The other way that we can do this, I'm going to clear out dual magnum. All right, now we have our whole Pula again. I'm still gonna work within this waterway here. And this time, instead of entering a product, I've simply clicked on the map where my application site was. And again, this is turned green, which means that I can get this bulletin. And what it's gonna do is give me the restriction for every single product. But at least now you're covered because you have every single restriction that there can possibly be. So here we have application month again, June 2024. Now for our product, it says all the products with limitations in the selected area. So we have our map. The limitation area is this dark gray now, although that doesn't match up exactly in the legend, but this is our limitation area. And now, and again, I've applied for a specialty crop grant so that we can manage this better. I won't know yet. But now we have, I think, about 57 pages of every single trade name, active ingredient, and use that would be under restriction in this area. So we have pages and pages. So if you know you're applying dual magnum, you can scroll down to the Ds, find your dual magnum line, and make sure that you're meeting that restriction. The advantage to this, I mean, it's clunky, 57 pages is clunky, but the advantage is that you're covered in that everything, if you've got this on file, you have all of the potential restrictions that are for your site. So this is our other option. And then we can see we have different codes here. We have a BAB 22, we have a BRF 22. So when we go down here, we have all of these different potential restrictions. All right.
4 minutes.
4 minutes, okay. One more thing that I'm gonna show you. And then I will open it up for questions. I can here. All right, we're gonna go over here to the east side. Now we're applying in this area where there's no Pula. My site is right here. We'll wait for that to turn green. And it's gonna work. I just wanted to show you the result. There it is. So this is gonna be what happens if you're in a spot where there's no active Pula. It's still gonna give you a bulletin. ODA is still gonna wanna see this. But if it ever shows up, what it's going to show you, it's just gonna read, there are no active restrictions in this area. And so you just have that on file. All right, if that works, I'll pull it up. There is an error, okay. Try one more time. Okay, I have an example of what that looks like in my slide set. If it's working, it is going to read like this. It says down here at the bottom, currently no pesticide use limitations exist within the printed map view. And so you can just have that on file for if you're on this site, there's no active limitations. Okay, record keeping we talked about a little bit. ODA is going to want to see that you have either saved the file or printed it off and included it with your paper records to show that you have followed the label requirements. ODA right now is mostly taking an education approach in that they are not targeting folks for Endangered Species Act compliance. However, if you're under audit, they're going to make sure that you've done it. If you're under an enforcement audit for any other reason, they're going to make sure that you've done it because that is a label requirement. And if you haven't, they're going to sit you down and they're going to do exactly what I just did and walk you through the system so that you know how to do it for the next time. Okay, Julie's giving me the look, so.
No, I'm not. But in my mind, I'm like, and if you get this error message, screenshot it, or hopefully, I mean, that's the thing too. It's like, there's going to be clunkies in the system to begin with, so.
And I'm gonna have to play with that because that's the first time I've gotten that error message.
Okay.
I haven't seen that one before, so.
Yeah, no, my glare was at that. It wasn't at you.
Okay, any questions? I think I have about a minute.
So what if you have a lot of application sites over a large area? Does a large screenshot
So,
or how zoomed in do you need to be to satisfy it?
yeah, you can be relatively zoomed out. So I think, I mean, we could just pull up one for the entire Willamette Valley. You would want to make sure that you get maybe the one that has the restrictions next to the river in it, because that's going to be you're going to want the one that has the most restrictions, which are right now next to the river. So you will want to watch because the whole idea is that these poolers are hopefully going to get more refined, and so we don't have these ones that go everywhere. That hopefully they're going to be more narrow. At the same time, the Willamette Valley has a fair number of listed species. So we don't know exactly how that's going to roll out in the future. So you want to make sure that whatever pula you click on in that blown out map, it's pretty clear which site your farms are in, or if there's one that is next to water, for example, or halfway in and halfway out of a pula, that's defined. Yeah.
I know in programs like Ag World, you can add farms and stuff like that directly into the program. Is there going to be a way to add fields specifically into this ever, or?
I know that a lot of the registrants and a lot of the larger consulting companies are begging EPA for an API so that they can start to add this into their programs. EPA is not currently doing that, but hopefully we get to that point.
I have a good memory. Yeah.
Okay,
All right.
Thank you so much, Dani.
Thanks, everybody.
Want to make mention of next week?
Oh, yeah, sure, thank you, Julie. So I have pretty much been living, eating, breathing, sleeping in the Endangered Species Act for the last several months. And we received a grant from the Western IPM Center to run a series of stakeholder workshops, specifically diving into the mitigations that EPA has proposed and the feasibility of